Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar this morning. My name is Sue Burgess, and I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Shrine of Remembrance. It's a pleasure to have you all online. The Shrine is held in care by the Shrine Trustees on behalf of all Victorians, and we embrace the diversity of our community and acknowledge the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of the land on which we honour Australian service and sacrifice. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present. And I'd also like to recognise the traditional owners of all of the countries that you may be coming from today. And to past and present members of the Australian Defence Force, if you're online with us today or listening later on, we welcome you and thank you for your service. So thank you for joining us today for this talk. I'm really excited about hearing from Nigel about war animals in the lead up to War Animal Remembrance Day. And you'll hear a bit more about that later in the talk. I'm going to hand over to Nigel shortly, but just a bit of housekeeping first. If you have a question, please put it into the chat function, and you'll see on the bottom of your screen, if you hover your mouse over there, you'll see a little box that says chat. Just open that up and pop your question in there, and my colleague Laura and I will be monitoring that as the talk goes on. And Nigel will hopefully answer as many of those as he can at the end. Please make sure your microphone is on mute so we don't get any background noise during the webinar. And the session is being recorded and will be sent to you in the coming days. So without further ado, it's my very great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Nigel Allsopp. Nigel is regarded as one of the world's leading service animal subject matter experts and has published 15 non-fiction books, including Anzac Mascots, which he'll speak about today. Nigel has spent over 40 years working professionally with animals, including as a military dog handler, police dog handler, zookeeper, wildlife ranger, and animal shelter supervisor. What a great set of jobs, Nigel. Nigel is also the president of the Australian War Memorials it's a bit of a tongue twister. Australian War Animals Memorial Organisation. I did practice, I promise, which is a not-for-profit that raises awareness around the deeds and sacrifices of all animal species who have given their lives and their loyalty serving alongside their human comrades. So a very warm welcome to Nigel, and thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you. It's my pleasure. Yeah, I look forward to sort of answering any questions that people may have. And please feel free to ask as many as you like towards the end. I guess I'll just start off with talking a little bit about mascots and their role. A lot of us, I guess, or those people that are interested in war animals anyway, immediately draw their attention to the famous light horse, for example, that our country is very famous for. And in modern times, we obviously see pictures of military working dogs. But there is another sort of sector that have always been going to war with Australians and New Zealand's Anzacs in general, and in fact the rest of the world, and that's mascots. And they perform an amazing sort of physical and psychological function, which has quite often been neglected. Um, sort of. So just to get on with the mascots, obviously we see a picture that happens to be Pegasus from the Parachute Regiment, a UK regiment, but that was just a good photo, I guess, to show that even modern times they have what we call official mascots. There are definitely two different types. And of course, Australia has plenty of mascots. For example, I'm currently living in Queensland, and in Queensland, the 8th and 9th RA or Australian Regiment has Stan the Ram. And they've had Stan the Ram, or at least similarities of Stan the Ram, a merino sheep for decades. In fact, I think we're up to Stan the Ram 7. The last time I heard Stan the Ram 7 was in a paddock trying to make Stan the Ram 8 as quickly as he could. But and we have the Army Engineers that famously used to have an ant at one stage, but they kept losing it, so they ended up getting a larger animal, and they ended up getting a dingo, as it happens. But that didn't successful because it was demoted several times for naughty behaviour, including biting superior officers. So the dog was had an official capacity in the military and went up with rank and wages, etc. So they've been very prolific. And I might go to the second slide if we could. Um, again, the two types that of mascots that are around the world um, are, in actual fact, what we call traditional or official mascots. Now, I've just got a couple of obvious ones. We'll come to some Australian Anzac ones shortly, but um, does it mean by tradition? Well, we can see the Irish Wolfhound is marching next to the Irish Rangers or the Irish Regiment of Ireland. Pretty obvious, really. I guess the connection there, both symbolic and sort of physical. The other one on the left is from the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers, and that's the black buck, and that's an Indian antelope. But the before they became the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers, traditionally they were called the Warwickshire Fusiliers, and they were stationed in India. And naturally, they wanted a mascot. They got a native animal at the time. It's in the 1870s, and that animal has stayed very much part of the regiment even today as a mascot. So that's what we call traditional mascots. And I'll ask to go to the next slide if we could. Yeah. Um, Goats. A lot of people think, never might have thought about goats, but everyone's possibly heard of a mascot ship's cat. And we'll discuss what cats used to do in a moment. But not many people realise the close significance of goat mascots. From the naval side of things, it stems back from um, not only companionship on the ships, but a lot of when it took 2 years to go around the world, for example, goats were quite often put in quite large numbers into ships, and as they visited, say, an island in the middle of the Pacific, they would deposit a couple of goats, and by the time they came back 2 years ago, they had plenty of food on the island. They probably then had 30 or 40 goats um, that were and obviously breeding. And another version was they gave milk, and in the days of scurvy, they supplied fresh meat. And again, going back in history, with the use of powered sails, they were also literally a mobile. Sadly, they had to end their life for it, but they were a mobile leather manufacturer. They could be skinned and tanned, and repairs to the ship could be used using leather. So, are they still used today? Yes, they are. In fact, the famous Welsh regiment that fought the Zulus um, still have a goat, as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner of my screen anyway, um, a goat, and that's actually currently stationed in Cyprus, where currently the regiment is. So again, in World War One, Anzacs, as pictured on the left, Australian and New Zealand soldiers used goats for milk, basically, and when you can imagine in the trenches, it was quite rare. So I'll get you to go to the next screen if I could. And obviously, some mascots are very. This is where we come more to the Australian era of, as you can see, a World War One's corporal holding a koala. Sadly, and I say sadly, a lot of Australians took koalas as well as macropods or kangaroos with them. In fact, interestingly, in Egypt in 1930, had the second largest wallaby population outside of Australia. There were so many wallabies taken over and released. Sadly, the reason I use the word sadly is people took these beautiful koalas, and as you probably know, there are over 200 species of gum trees in Australia, but there's only about 12, a dozen, that koalas actually eat. Um, so they weren't there, and a lot of them starved to death, sadly. People tried to feed them various food, but they never really survived very well. But why did they take those from Australia? Well, it was a bit of home, wasn't it? Remembering, you know, sort of a little bit of home, and I understand that. I'm a veteran myself, and I'm one of the tours of duty I did, for example, was in Mogadishu in Somalia, and we took over grass. It's a desert country. We took over a square meter of grass, which we lovingly looked after and watered. You could call it our mascot. It reminded us of home, a bit of greenery. So that's why I guess Australians took native animals over there, just to, not only as companions, but to remind them a bit of home, the family, and the loved ones they missed. As you can see with the nurse in the picture, um, the nurse, it's actually a hospital in the UK where Australian troops were rehabilitated, and there was a famous kangaroo there and a wallaby, um, and they were used just for morale purposes, hopping around literally the hospital wards. You can also see some people took some quite exotic animals with them. We see a baboon there that was actually part of the Canadian regiment, and down in you can see in France they had a couple of lions actually, lion cubs. I guess the problem with the lions, which did happen, is all lion cubs grow up to be big lions, and at one stage there they got very very aggressive, and they had to end up being reallocated to a zoo. You can imagine the surprise of some people jumping in a trench and seeing a full-sized lioness feeding them. It would have been quite hilarious, I suppose, in some cases. All right, we'll go to the next one, I guess, if we could. Again, the Navy always have had a tradition, as well as the Air Force. It's not just the Army that had animals in the trenches. We see a pig actually in World War II that was captured from a German ship, the Topaz, and he was very much kept as a pet for a while. Many people, unfortunately, wanted to convert him to bacon or pork sausages, and I believe that his taxidermied head is still actually in the Royal Navy Museum. I guess just going over to our Anzac cat to the right there, they cats have always been in the Navy. We even have evidence of cats being on ships in the Egyptian Navy, 4 to 5,000 years ago. So why did we have cats? Well, believe it or not, in Australia, right up to 1973, 74, it was constituted in standard operating procedures that all ships did have a cat for rodent control. One of the modern factors of, I guess, pardon me, hygiene and OH&S was stopped in the 70s, and cats no longer are official mascots. But again, they were needed predominantly from rodent control. And you can imagine in the olden ships where there were grains and sacks of food, you had rats. They seem to be able to get everywhere in a ship, no matter what precautions you take, and on large vessels anyway. And these cats supplied not only morale but sort of aid and comfort. I guess uh, even though we have a very both multicultural and multi-sex armed forces, gendered force today, predominantly in the Navy many years ago, it was a male bastion. And quite often these animals were used as to, I guess, give affection and love. You can imagine it was very difficult, perhaps more psychologically, and a bit of testosterone too much, men, loving men, in an emotional state, I mean. And therefore, a mascot was something you could literally love and cuddle and even, pat and kiss, and without anyone giving you a hard time, being soft or whatever those old-fashioned values may have been at the time. You can see the Air Force have always been famous for having mascots, pilots in particular. This one happens to be a fox in World War One. During World War Two, Australian airmen had numerous amounts of pets. In fact, I supplied a bronze plaque called Pooches and Pilots, which is in a museum, the Australian or the RAF Museum in Australia, just honouring all the mascot dogs predominantly that airmen used to have as mascots in the RAF. So I'll get to the next one if we could. All right. So some of them. So as I said before, we had a situation where we have official mascots, which we still have today, and the official mascots are paid for by the Defence Department in our case, and or a particular regiment, and they actually are on establishment, so they get rations for them, paid for by the government, veterinary bills paid for by the government, etc. But most mascots in actual fact, were unofficial, obtained in situ, or perhaps on the way. And I'll just talk about one of these. It happens to be Canadian, and the others are Anzac animals. I'll talk about in a moment. Um, but I couldn't help put this one in the slide just for perhaps a little historical point. Um, this is a black bear. It's important to know that. It's also important to know it's a female bear, um, and it comes from Canada. And it was picked up in Winnipeg, I beg your pardon, on the way by this veterinary officer. The actual plight of this cub was a trapper in Canada had killed its mother, and this cub was being sold. Um, he brought it for 25 Canadian dollars, and as companionship, he took it to World War One, the Europe. You can imagine how terrifying it must have been for any animal, for that matter, but particularly for this bear, to to sort of face the agonies of war, the loud noises, the mud, the hardship, etc. Um, and obviously and understandably, this bear sort of freaked out, I guess we'll say in modern terminology. And the mascot owner took it to the London Zoo when he was on leave, and it lived at the London Zoo for the rest of its life. And it grew up, and kids used to come in World War One and during it and post and feed it. And they used to feed it honey sandwiches, this male bear. And one day, um, a guy called Milne was watching his son um, feed the bear and thought, wow, I could write a book on that. And his son was called Christopher Robin. And of course, the book Winnie the Pooh, which obviously is a male golden sort of coloured bear, but the rest is actually based on fact. That book, which is quite interesting. Um, the other one, I guess, it's just pretty interesting to Anzacs. It's currently living in New Zealand. Is the tortoise. It's the only mascot, by the way, from World War One that's still alive. He's over 200 years old. Torty, original name. You can Google and find out information on him on NAM, the National Army Museum in Waiouru. And he's still kicking around. He hibernates most of the time, but it's estimated that he was about 100 years when the Anzac soldiers got him. In Gallipoli, there were a lot of these Greek tortoises around. Um, Sadly, a lot of the Indian troops used to eat them, and this guy was rescued from the pot of an Indian stretcher bearers and ended up becoming a mascot. And he's obviously unique for being alive. The other cat the cat here called Oscar, again, just giving him some background. He's a very famous cat that you can Google, and I think his name should have been Lucky, not Oscar. He was originally a German cat on the Bismarck, and when the Bismarck was sunk, most of the hands went down, as you're aware, with only a handful of survivors and Oscar. Um, and he was picked up by a British destroyer along with the surviving crew and rescued. Um, and He was on the ship for a while. Unfortunately, that escort vessel got sunk itself. And you guessed it, several crew members survived along with Oscar. So he's picked up by a third ship. And again, that was sunk, and some of the crew survived. And Oscar, he later went on to the famous Ark Royal into the Mediterranean towards the Rock of Gibraltar there. And that ship was sunk, and Oscar survived. At this stage, the British fleet said, well, I don't know about lucky, probably unlucky. So he was condemned to stay for the rest of his life either at the Rock of Gibraltar or ended up in the United Kingdom as a mascot, but definitely shore-based. And he was never allowed back out at sea again. I guess one of our most famous mascots, which sort of floated between the traditional and the in situ mascot, is Digger up on the right-hand corner. Now, Digger was the recipient of the British Blue Cross Award, and which I presented to Digger's original owner's grandson, and at the West Croydon in South Australia. And my charity paid for a small monument of Digger. Digger was very famous because he literally followed this soldier in Melbourne onto the train. They got onto the troop ship. They ended up going to a place called Gallipoli. And good old Digger survived in the trenches of Gallipoli. He was shot a total of 3 times, including, you may just see his jaw in the picture is a little sort of down there, sagging. He was shot through the jaw, and all this he survived. He survived as well as his handler Gallipoli, and they were posted to the Western Front to a place called Pozières in France. And in fact, Pozières, as you probably know, is a very poignant place. That's when I was privileged to become the Anzac of the Year for the RSL in 2017. I got to open Australia's official war animal memorial in Pozières, which again you can Google and have a look at in your leisure. And there's a small plaque for Digger there as well. He survived 16 separate battles. And remember, he was a mascot, but rather than waste his talents, they trained him. And Digger the reason he was wounded, he used to go into no man's land between the Allies and the Germans' dead ground. And he used to locate living Anzac survivors. He had a little pannier bag on him with a notebook, and he was trained to bring back a hat or a note from a wounded soldier. And it's sort of fairly economical, if not sort of slightly callous, but the stretcher bearers wouldn't risk their lives going into no man's land. Very brave men, absolutely, but it was very dangerous. So they wouldn't obviously go and need to recover a dead body. So they risked their lives by going out and rescuing obviously wounded Anzac soldiers. And the dog would locate a wounded soldier hidden in the mud or under shell holes or bushes, etc., if there were many left. And they would indicate that they were alive. The dog would come back and then lead the stretcher bearers out. Unfortunately, in Pozières, the Germans employed a lot of gas, and it affected Digger very greatly. And that picture you see is actually of a postcard, which the soldiers produced themselves, and they sent all around the world to raise funds to buy skin cream for his, I'll just call it a form of eczema, but the gas created a skin complaint. And this cream was used to ease the dog's tension. Well, hardly any animals, as you may be aware, were ever returned to Australia. For example, of the 136,000 whaler horses that left our shores, only one, Sandy, was ever returned to Australia, and that was to carry the spurs and boots of a general that got killed in World War One. So our record for returning animals home, particularly in World War One and Two, was very poor. But Digger's handler ended up getting what we now know as PTSD. Some people don't use the D, by the way, as they believe it's not a disorder, but post-traumatic stress. And so Digger ended up coming back to Australia. And unfortunately, he thought the war was over for Digger. And the handler was in hospital on Federation Day in about 1922 at the stage. And sadly, Federation Day, fireworks, big yahooing, big loud bangs. The dog thought the war was on again. He was outside and he's jumped a fence to go ultimately and I guess warn his handler. We know that because he ended up on the handler's bed where he died because sadly when he jumped the fence, picket fence, he skewered himself in the body and managed to get to his handler and then passed away. So a very sad story. Digger, perhaps not for everybody, but he's still able to be seen, or at least his hide is, at the Australian War Museum in Canberra. They actually tanned his hide. They also have his collar, which is on exhibit on occasions, probably for the 24th of February, I would imagine. They bring things out like that every now and then. And a sad story, but he saved unknown amount of lives. And again, so he was one of those grey areas where he was, ended up being not an official mascot, but was officially sort of used by the AIF, the predecessor to the ADF. Am I going okay, Laura? I don't want to waffle too much. without a break for anyone. But I'll just go on to the next picture then, because that's World War II. The previous picture. Could I just go back? That was Smokey in the helmet. That's a very famous World War II dog. It too has a Blue Cross award, um, and a Purple Cross award, and an American award. In fact, it's in the Guinness Book of Records, which I would encourage you to look at. It's the most highly decorated war dog, believe it or not, and it's a 4-pound Yorkshire Terrier. Most people would think it'd be a big German Shepherd, wouldn't they, or a similar animal? But Smokey, that statue, I actually not made. I what's the word? I funded, and a sculptor called Susan Bahari, a beautiful lady, donated it. It's all in bronze and a bronze World War II American helmet. Now, why is that a famous Australian dog if it was used by Americans? Well, it was born in Brisbane, Queen Street, in fact, in a veterinary shop. Um, it was purchased by an Australian soldier for his nurse sweetheart in World War II in Kokoda. Unfortunately, his nurse sweetheart decided that perhaps she didn't love um, him as much as he thought, and they didn't get married. So this Australian soldier was quite depressed, and he owed £6, British pounds, I guess, in those days, to a guy called Bill Wynne, a corporal in the United States Army Air Force. Now, Bill used to be part of MacArthur's personal entourage, one of his mechanics for his planes. So Bill used to come back and forth to Brisbane all the time in World War II. As you may be aware, General McCarthy had his headquarters in Brisbane. And so Bill got dengue. So Bill, instead of getting his £6 gambling debts, accepted Smokey as payment, and they were inseparable for about 14 years. Smokey ended up dying in the United States when Bill smuggled him back to America in his rucksack. But he was a real hero, the dog in itself. He came back to Australia several times, and one of the occasions Bill had or caught dengue fever and was in hospital. And the doctors there um, noticed that a young lieutenant, naval doctor, worked, remembering the Brisbane hospital was the US Navy and US Marine Corps hospital in those days. And a doctor noticed that every time the dog jumped next to a patient, the patient would improve, morale wise, psychologically. And he's now he's in the Guinness Book of Records, as I said, as the world's first post-traumatic stress dog. And he was used. Now, that lieutenant, by the way, naval lieutenant, ended up becoming a very famous doctor in the United States, curing cancer at the time, or up until recent times when he obviously passed away, and even has a hospital named after him. And so I beg your pardon, Smokey ended up going back to the United States, where Bill was a TV show host, and Smokey appeared on the television for about 3 or 4 years. And not many people know Smokey, but a lot of people know one of the other dogs that Bill helped establish and train for TV. And that dog was called Lassie. So Bill's a very sort of famous man. So if we can go to the next one now. This is more modern. As we can see, there's Stan the Ram. I knew I had him somewhere. He's a beautiful animal, obviously a merino. And, what a great symbol for Australia, if you think about it. I think the engineers did try to have a wombat, but he literally kept running away. Wombats are pretty hard to. I know as a zookeeper, when I was a zookeeper for a number of years, wombats are particularly well. You can't really train them, shall we say? Shall we use that word? Train them is almost impossible. But if you get them young enough, they'll follow you around. But they're not really designed to sort of be a pet. Now, but some of the units up north, the Pilbara Regiment, for example, has a monitor lizard. So a lot of Australian mascots are Australian animals. There are obviously exceptions. One of the infantry regiments, 3 Ras, has a pony because it used to be called Pegasus, because it used to be a parachute regiment, as you may know, or airborne sort of associated. Um, and but I also mentioned to you before, this is a modern British regiment too, and you'll notice has a ferret. Well, how the hell does a modern British infantry regiment have a ferret as a mascot? Well, they actually have 2 ferrets, as it happens, um, and it stems back again to World War One, where um, they, as you know, ferrets are pretty good ratters in their own right, um, and these ferrets were donated by a gentleman for the Lancashire Regiment at the time. And these ferrets, literally were used to keep the rats away in the trenches in World War One. And since then, that tradition has stuck. So they still have a ferret today. You'll see in Norway, their emblem is a king or emperor, I beg your pardon, penguin, inspecting the troops. You'll see his little badge on his arm. It obviously lives at the local zoo as opposed to the regiment, but that's the mascot for a particular Norwegian regiment, and probably very apt given the climatic conditions, I guess. All right, so we go to the next slide, I guess. And again, animals that became mascots also had practical uses. You can see these fowls, chickens, and ducks with troops in World War One. They're literally a source of protein, literally eggs or meat for that matter, as well as, I guess, companionship. And that cockerel in the bottom in Australia, in Egypt, was a very famous mascot for one of our units. Cows were often grabbed. The left happens to be a New Zealander unit, but still in the theme of Anzacs. And again, cows were used for milk. In fact, every French regiment used to get a milking goat as part of their perhaps rations, in which they were supposed to use for milk. Obviously, you'll notice canaries on the right-hand side. Well, they were used both as mascots and pets, but they also had a very practical function for our mining troops or tunneling troops. You may know that coal miners used to use um, canaries, and it's a sort of a happy, sad story, I guess. But they were taken down the mines. They were very susceptible to carbon monoxide poisoning because of their particular olfactory scent glands that they have in them. And so, quite literally, if the bird fell off the perch, it was time to get the hell out of the mine because the air was poisoned. And that's how they used to be used. But you can imagine how a lot of them ended up being pets as well. So they carried out. So these animals you see are not only mascots and pets, but they're also a very practical, um, sort of form of for food, I guess, and for safety. Okay, the next one, if we wouldn't mind. Some of the big things that we sponsor, my charity, for example, we've trained so far 17 registered post-traumatic stress dogs and assistance dogs. We even work. We donate many thousands of dollars to an Australian riding program, um, both the Riding for Disabled and also Mates for Mates in Victoria. Operate about half a dozen horses where they take veteran soldiers. Now, the reason our horses that we operate up here and have 2 functions. Some they ride and some they don't. Um, and obviously they are pets and mascots for people and morale boosters, and that's why I've got them on the slide. You'll notice the gentleman that is an amputee, a doubling amputee, in the middle picture. Well, one of the best ways that the Veterans Affairs in Australia and in the United States predominantly have found the riding of horses is very useful. I can't obviously stand up and generate, but what it demonstrate, but what it is, the motion of our hips when we're riding a horse are the same as the motion that's needed to move those artificial limbs to walk. And so they actually use horses to aid amputee victims to be able to walk again. Now, on the other side, we have horses that don't get ridden. They're just there to talk to. Now, I don't know if any of you listening own horses, and I'll be interested to hear if you do later on. But my experience of horses, unlike a dog, they are reasonably aloof. If you don't sort of touch them or talk to them, they quite happily just ignore you in many cases. And what this does for people suffering from post-traumatic stress is it forces them to engage with a horse. And of course, as soon as they start engaging, talking to a horse, some of them, you know, have been silent with trauma for many years. I've got a personal, beautiful story. When I was a police dog handler, we used to take, and so I know how the system works at Christmas time, and sadly at the Mater Hospital in June, because a lot of the children, sadly, in that particular ward wouldn't live until Christmas. So we used to do 2 Christmases a year. But there was a victim of child abuse there. I took my police dog in there. This child hadn't spoken to any staff, for example, for about 6 weeks. But as soon as my police dog went in there and licked her face, she was jabbering away and talking to me. She came up holding my hand, and it's the first male's hand she's ever held in about 2 years, because she was actually, sadly, and I don't want to be too depressing, sadly abused by her own brother and father. So, yeah, animals do work, and that's the point, and I won't linger on that. But as you can see, they perform a great function morale-wise in rehabilitation, and leading back to what predominantly the talk is about, mascots. This is exactly what mascots did in the trenches and in all wars. Come to that, they were not just physical things to cuddle and talk to remember a bit of your home, a bit of your family, to remember is a horrible thing for any of you veterans out there like myself that's had to experience it. You want to sort of remind yourself that you love something and love people, and it's a great thing. So they performed a great psychological function, I guess. Mascots. Can we have the next slide, please? I think this might be, Laura, one of the last ones, and this is just an indication of how my charity honours animals in war. On the far right, I was privileged to be the Australian representative for the opening of the Commonwealth War Horse in Ascot, where the racing is, and that was opened up by Prince Harry. No politics here, but when he was in favour, uh, and and the and I'm privileged to be also now part of the new American War Animal Memorial as their director in charge of education, which they'll be opening up in New York in a short period of time. The one with the horse that says Australian War Animal Memorial, that's in Pozières, in France. Again, that was made by Susan Bahari. In fact, most of these models artwork was made by her. She's an American, but she's a wonderful benefactor to my charity. And that's called Rising Spirits. And it's literally half a horse emerging out the mud of the Somme. And you can't see it very closely, but I would encourage you to sort of perhaps, use Google and have a look at the pictures, and perhaps Susan Bahari's uh, web page as well. You can't see that, but in that mane is several mascots. There's a horse, a donkey, a pigeon, a Jack Russell Terrier, and a cat, I believe, all in three-dimensionally in that mane. It's a beautiful. The I see someone has already looked up Nam on the chat show there. That's the one to its left. The other horse, that's obviously in the New Zealand Army Museum in Waiouru, again to honour all New Zealand animals. They're very similar to our history. 10,000 horses left New Zealand, only 4 were ever returned, and that's pretty common source for all animals. In fact, officially, no war ADF animal was returned to Australia officially until an area where I served in Mogadishu in Somalia. There were 3 explosive detection dogs part of the engineer regiment attached to 1 Ra, and they actually all returned. They were the first official war animals to be officially returned. Previous animals before that, for example, I have some friends and colleagues that were, if any of you people are out there are perhaps Vietnam veterans, you may be aware that Australia took 11 Labradors or Labrador crosses to Vietnam. And sadly, again, due to government protocols, and I won't go into the politics of that either, but all were left in situ on our enemy's shores, basically. Look, the dog handlers did an amazing job of, trying to keep them alive by giving them to people there, either be locals or official government Australian people in the embassies and things like that. And it was my privilege to, on the 50th anniversary of Vietnam, I managed to get a bronze plaque established at what is now called Ho Chi Minh City. Even now, the animosity is such that I couldn't get a memorial to one of the 11 dogs that were left behind on the street, but it's on the wall of the Australian Consulate Generals in Ho Chi Minh City. Now, finally, on the left-hand side, again, a little out of track, but I just mention it. That's a memorial I established for the Indigenous soldiers, and I just put that there for an interesting. That's Indigenous light horsemen. I beg your pardon, not Indigenous soldiers per se. The Indigenous soldiers that worked with animals in World War One, the Boer War, sorry, and World War Two. Sadly, we don't. That was the first ever light horse memorial, I believe, not only in Queensland but in Australia, to honour Indigenous light horsemen. The face which the elders gave me was that of Uncle Finney. Now, none of you might know Uncle Finney. I actually wrote a book on him, but he survived World War One. In fact, he used to break horses for the AIF in what is now the Sinai. And who is Uncle Finney? Well, you might not know, but you know his granddaughter, Kathy Freeman, which is probably quite a good part of the story. So if he hadn't survived the war, we wouldn't have had Kathy Freeman winning a gold medal for Australia. So isn't it funny how things are connected? And I don't know if there's another one, Laura, or not. Screen. Oh no, that's just me. Sorry. And apologies. And so yeah, I've sort of spent, as I said, most of my life either as a military dog handler, an explosive detection dog handler in the police in Queensland here, and as a mounted police officer, both in the United States and in Australia. But I spent a large part of my time as a zookeeper in Auckland Zoo, Dubbo Zoo, San Diego Zoo, and at one stage I trained the sea lions in SeaWorld. But so I've been privileged to work with animals basically all my life, and yeah, they are a major sort of, I guess, part of my life. But I've realised how important they are to our nation. Australia wouldn't be what it is without animals. I mean, we have to remember, horses and the cattle dogs made this country when it was an agricultural country for 100 years, due to lack of transport, train and roads. These animals made Australia, and we owe much to animals, I believe, and we should honour their deeds and sacrifices in war. For example, the 800 horses that we romantically see in the charge of Bathsheba that are frequently honoured. They were just the surface of the animals, because the cavalry. I know they were mounted infantry, but cavalry horses, if I can generically call them that, are the romantic fast horses that do the galloping and the charging. But behind them were 3,000 heavy horses, Clydesdales, donkeys, mules, and ponies that carried everything from rations, toilet paper, and the wounded back. Obviously, our most famous one being Simpson, and one of 5 donkeys he had, not just the one we tend to celebrate. Without animals, I guess the charge of Bathsheba would have been the very brisk walk of Bathsheba. So they're very much an important part of the ADF.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Nigel. That was absolutely fascinating. And I'm sure we're going to get some questions appearing in the chat shortly. So we do have a little bit of time for some questions. I mean, you've given us an amazing amount of information, Nigel. The one, whilst we're waiting for some other participant questions perhaps to come through, I'm really curious about Torty. Can you tell us a little bit more about Torty and perhaps how they kept him safe?
Yeah, sure. And for those interested, by the way, the that Nam has a wonderful sort of cartoon, goes for about 5 minutes on him for education and some great facts if people want to find further information. But yeah, he was predominantly a New Zealand animal as opposed to Australian, hence why he's living over there. With I believe the great granddaughter of its original handler, and he was, I believe, just rescued from the cooking pot and just kept as a mascot, as a pet. And he pretty much stayed in the trenches and just kept soldiers amused. And like any veteran that I'm sure you know and maybe listening, war I guess is 90% boredom and 10% terrifying. And so a lot of the time is downtime. So it was just like basically a morale booster. Unlike other animals, he didn't sort of perform a function, I guess. um, you know,
I think that's been the other interesting part for me too is seeing things like ferrets and penguins and other interesting animals who perhaps have sort of broader symbolism than just being animals that can assist. And I
yeah,
personally am very interested in what dogs are able to do for us because with all of our technological advancements, we still use dogs particularly and horses of course, but I think dogs, I wonder if you could just speak a little bit about sort of the training of those sorts of dogs and perhaps some of the characteristics that we might look for when you
sure.
yeah.
Well, sure, absolutely. Well, I'll start off with my, sort of my own sort of, I guess, police dog. Sally just passed away. That's well, I've got a new puppy asleep on the ground here. uh, um, as its replacement. But I had an explosive detection dog, for example, in the Queensland Police, and she worked through the Commonwealth Games and G20, and we basically obtained dogs round about the 12 to 18 month mark. And what we look for is drive. That's what, like almost an obsession to catch a ball or something like that. And um, the the we train that through repetition and association. We slowly replace that ball or cloth with an odor. In this case, it's explosives. It could be narcotics. We also operate cadaver or cadaver, depending how you want to pronounce it, detection dogs, and track of dogs, general duties, that find missing persons or bad people, criminals. It's all training through repetition and association at quite a reasonable sort of mature age. And the example with that, I'm not giving too many secrets away, but obviously it takes about 13 to 14 weeks to train an explosive detection dog across enough odors for it to be used operationally. Most explosives are made up of many scents, thousands, but they all tend to have about a dozen specific scents that are present in every of them. So as you can imagine, it's impossible to train for 33,000 different odors, for example, but we can train over those 12 or so, and everything else has a bit of that, including HME, homemade explosives and things like that. And so the dogs are used certainly in the police forces to save time as well as lives. So a dog will go into an area that has a suspect explosive device. It will locate it. It will usually sit down on what they call a passive alert. Um, and then the real heroes come in. That's the guys that from the bomb squad that actually physically have to go in there and disarm or neutralize the explosive device. But obviously, dogs are killed. Sadly, the ADF lost Herbie the dog and two wonderful engineers. One of them being I knew, one of them I didn't know, and Darren Smith I knew personally. And we lost them in Afghanistan. And, Darren and his engineer friend, and just please forgive me for just forgetting his name for the moment. I'm sure we should look that up. Um, Both these brave Australian soldiers gave their lives rescuing or saving the lives of all the soldiers that would have been killed in that massive bomb had the dog not detected that roadside explosive. So,
Mm.
many mothers owe their sons' lives and daughters' lives to those two gentlemen. And so the dog was very much a part of that. And so that's how, sadly, because they are so good, people like the Taliban target them, because they are an asset. But they, like everything else, they're a tool um, of a big program. It still takes people to. Yes, thank you for whoever put
That was Laura.
Jacob's name up. Thank you very much. And uh, so yeah, they're very much part of a tool. In regard to the army, the army have this wonderful scheme. I'd love for the police to do it myself. They have a second chance scheme, so they get all their dogs, or predominantly they get their dogs from the pound. Um, and so, hence the second chance, second life. And they use a lot of Kelpie type base dogs, which are ideal for Australian conditions and obviously the heat of Afghanistan.
Mm.
There's some wonderful breeds, and people often say, well, why not use this breed or that breed? But um, for the police, they tend to use Labradors or German Shepherds, even though, Belgian Shepherds, also known as Malamars, are becoming increasing. Just, I've got to say, for uniformity, where the army tend to use, the best dog for the job,
Mm.
that's got that beautiful retrieve mechanism in it.
Well, we've got some questions that have come through whilst you've been sharing all that. That's fantastic. I'm very interested in dogs particularly. We've got a question from Edna about were the animals given any sort of vitamin supplements?
Well, I guess they have a very the great thing, and I better not mention the company's name because I know we're not political and I don't want to advertise for anyone. But there are dog food manufacturers out there that produce dog biscuits specially designed for military and police working dogs, and all
Ah,
those type of things are in there. And I better not mention their names, I guess.
no, better not.
Yeah, yeah.
And a question from Jenny now. What are the blue and purple awards you mentioned, and how do they relate to the Dickon Medal?
Okay. First of all, let me say I'm the UK's representative for the Blue Cross Medal and the Dickens Medal, and I've um, uh, actually, and I'll can I just go out of focus for 1 second? So, apart from an army dog, which fought with the SAS, and got the only dog that received the Dickens Medal, which I'll explain about. My police dog, in actual fact, if you can see that, can you see that at all?
Yeah, a little bit. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, pretty hard with the sun. My police dog is
There you go.
the only,
Venus.
yeah, yeah,
PDSA
Venus is the
commendation.
only recipient of the Dickens Medal Commendation Award in Australia, for bravery. Consequently, I got nothing, by the way, but she got everything, but I'm not bitter. No, I was, yeah. And so and for the Blue Cross, is obviously British based. The Purple Cross it's now stopped in 2015. It used to be run by the RSPCA, but due to politics, shall I say, they've got a new clause, Section 4, which don't allow them to recognise animals, working animals. It's just, something they do. I'm not going down that track, but they've stopped that award. And Smokey was the last dog to ever receive that in Australia. And so we didn't have anything. And so we had to rely on the British. And both the Dickens Award was started, initially as would you believe, called the Dumb Animals League way
Hmm.
back in the early or the late 18th century, 1870 something. Don't quote me on the exact date, but and that was given to predominantly horses in wars, and then it came about in World War One. And at one stage, it was given to human beings, the Dickens Medal, and animals, but now it's just animals. And again, it's done for bravery. Now, the definition of bravery in an animal, I won't necessarily go political, but some people believe in dogs being sentient beings. Some people don't. Some people think, well, bravery is the wrong word. How does a dog show bravery? So there is, backward and forward, but it's called a bravery medal. And it's given to dogs that, as it suggests, act in a form of heroism and or save lives and things like that. And interestingly, it's not dogs, but the largest recipient of the Dickens Medal are pigeons, in actual fact, messenger pigeons. And they have an amazing, I could speak for an hour just on Australian war pigeons, one of the most unknown heroes that we have in Australia, the deeds they've done. But and they're both. So uh, again, what I'm currently trying to do and work with the National Canine Council and the RSPCA, and the police have already approved it. So their support, the defence have already approved it. I'm trying to establish our own um, sort of distinguished or bravery, whatever I haven't made up my mind yet to call it, but medal for Australian animals, rather than relying on Britain and the United States have their own. Um, you know, we should have our own. Just like, for example, our soldiers receive the Australian Victoria Cross, not the British Victoria Cross. Um, you know, um, some people get the OAM as opposed to the MBE now. So it's no one's complaining about those medals, but I'd like to just do it Australian. And we're sort of trying to do that as best we can with as much support from organisations as we can to help recognise that. And uh, um, I didn't think to bring one, but I've actually got a picture of the medal. I might send Laura the medal design just for you to put on to have a look
Yeah,
at it. Yeah.
that could be some great extra content. And we might actually take you up on a talk about pigeons, and we could that could be another webinar. So stay tuned.
Yeah. Yeah.
Another question from Edna about the odor training that you talked about with dogs. Do younger dogs have a higher sense of acute smells, or are they able to distinguish those smells more than an older dog might be able to?
Well, age-wise, not necessarily different. In my sort of experiences, there are some, like in America, for example, they start training their um, narcotic detection dogs with the mothers as puppies, several weeks old, and basically they just learn from their mother um, a bit. When the mother reacts to a certain odor and she gets fed, it doesn't take the dogs long, even though they're still, in many cases, feeding off. They identify through repetition and association. Well, if I smell that and sit down, I get something to eat. So they're quite smart. But having said that, rather than baffle people with science, I'll explain it really easily. They have about the olfactory scent gland in a dog is about 300 million plus compared to human beings. What does that mean in language, a pictorial language? If we pulled out our olfactory scent glands in a human being, they're about the size of a postage stamp. In a dog, they're about the size of a king-size bed sheet if you pull them out and stretch them out. So the dog literally sees the world, through its nose. Hence why they smell people's butts. and which is another dog, by the way, we've helped train for prostate cancer and things like that. Literally, a dog can smell things like that. So that they've got a myriad of sort of everyone just thinks of, I guess, seeing eye dogs, but they could be literally trained for anything. But yeah, sort of without being a politician and not answering her question, it's yes to both. They're pretty born with a really decent set, and obviously, like everything, it develops. I don't know when it stops. Is the truth? But my bomb detection dog was working up until it was 12 years of age. And it only got better. So yeah,
Well,
I'd say yes to both if I can
right.
answer it that way.
Yeah, fascinating. All right. Well, it's 11:59, so we'll need to wrap up now. And I'm sure that the more you think about this, the more questions that we could potentially ask Nigel. But we do have to call a halt to it now. So hopefully you've found out a lot more new information today about animals and their role in service history and as mascots. I certainly have, I can tell you that. For those of you in Melbourne, we are holding a last post service this Sunday to commemorate War Animal Remembrance Day. Last year was the first time we'd done that, and we got a great turnout. It was an absolutely terrific day. So it starts at 4:45 p.m. on Sunday at the shrine on the forecourt, and it is free to attend. You're also welcome to bring your pets along, who clearly won't be as well trained as Nigel's police dogs. Maybe they are, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
You're very welcome to bring them along, but they do need to be leashed. And we hope you can join us for that special commemoration if you are in Melbourne. We also host a range of other events, and you can join us for those. If you look at our Shrine website, or you can subscribe to our e-newsletter to find out what's going on here at the Shrine. Lots of different things going on. So thank you again, and I hope you've enjoyed this session with Nigel. We certainly have. And have a good day, everybody. Bye now.
Thank you. Thanks, Sue. And Sue, it's probably too late, but don't forget, you can buy a purple poppy from the Shine shop and wear it on the day too. I'm sure they would appreciate that.
Thank you. Indeed, you can.